So let's get into this. I want to, and I'm going to read the title of your presentation, Calum, because I think it sort of captures everything we want to talk about. The problem with experts, science, and scientism in the post-truth age. And I think in context of what we're going to talk about, I feel like all of us in our different roles in educating and engaging and trying to understand the world, we're sort of part of this counter-revolution against the kind of expertise that you're describing in your paper. But give us a general thesis of what your talk was about.
Sure. So the paper was entitled, as you said, "The Problem with Experts, Science and Scientism in the Post-Truth Age." And my basic point is that obviously in the last few years, we've seen a lot of loss of confidence in sort of technocratic forms of expertise. And often people see this as a sort of epistemic apocalypse, a knowledge apocalypse, a cataclysm. But, excuse me, just getting over the flu a couple of weeks ago. So a lot of people see it as a kind of a knowledge apocalypse of people are losing faith in the truth. But it seems to me that something else may be going on. And it's worth noting that the word apocalypse actually has two meanings. The modern meaning is cataclysm, but the original meaning was the revelation of what has previously been concealed. And I think there's really two ways in light of this we can view the post-truth age. One is people irrationally losing faith in objective truth. And the other is people quite rationally coming to realize the emperor had no clothes. And I think this is something we've seen growing over the last 14, 15 years. I mean, starting probably with the financial crisis. I remember quite famously, Alan Greenspan came out looking very baffled at a press conference after 40 years in which he'd been lauded as this guru of finance. And he came out at a press conference and said, with touching naivety, he said, the problem is, I think our theory of how the world worked was wrong. It was a very interesting concession because it presumed that previously he thought he had a theory of how the world worked, which is an interesting hubris. And but I think that was the first crack. And I think what we've seen since in lots of areas of culture are people come to realize that the emperor had no clothes. So, for instance, with Afghanistan, there was this evangelical faith that we not only had liberal democracies, but we had a theory of why we had liberal democracies, and we could flat pack and export this to other countries as if it was an IKEA assembly chair and bring it to other countries. And the lie's been given to this idea that you can have a technocratic formula for democracy by the failure of nation building in Afghanistan, and certainly the fact that the efforts there have proved to basically be the equivalent of political economic Esperanto. It was something they tried to apply to Afghanistan, this idealized view of how you should live. And actually, it just all dissolved into smoke as soon as the people advocating it and evangelizing for it left. And you can see it also in what's happened, of course, with COVID, that we can all agree, or hopefully we can agree that COVID is real, and the epidemiology of COVID's been pretty good, and the virology's been good, and the vaccine stuff's been, I think, pretty good. But the question of the proportionality of lockdowns is simply not a question that science can answer. And yet governments have been saying for the last 18 months or almost 2 years now, saying we're following the science in our policies. But the question of the proportionality of a lockdown, so the question of whether there's anything more important in life than the avoidance of death, for instance, whether lives matter more than livelihoods, which I think is a false dichotomy to begin with. All these sorts of questions are as much questions of value and culture as they are science and fact. They're as much about the subjective values we have, such as our culturally relative, subjective, quite personal views of what is an acceptable level of risk. They're as much about that as about the science of the disease itself. And we've seen this culture in which the politicians have given up their not just their capacity, but their obligation to discuss these subjective questions, to decide who are we as a culture. And they said, oh, the scientists will decide it for us. Even the scientists are not actually qualified or even informed enough to talk about subjective questions of value. So there's been this reframing in the culture of many forms of expertise as only scientific forms. And I think people are beginning in the culture to see that this is that the emperor has no clothes. These people are not objective authorities about what should be subjective questions. And so you can see it in finance, we can see it in Afghanistan, we see it with COVID. You can also see it in the climate debate, which is a whole other discussion.